Hello, and welcome to Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables, a look inside America's electoral system. I'm your host, Ben Ginsberg, and each week through the end of the 2022 election season, we'll be examining the issues surrounding the casting, counting, and certification of this year's voting. This week, we welcome Mindy Flynn, who's done a fascinating and cutting-edge data and survey work to gain insight into the electorate, particularly those who doubt the veracity of our election. Mindy is the CEO of Citizen Data, has led large-scale campaigns and initiatives to reduce polarization and improve elections throughout a 20-year career within Congress, presidential campaigns, and major tech companies. Citizen Data is the entity she's using to do this research, and it is a mixture of engineering data and marketing analytics solutions that, Mindy, I believe you want to help bridge divides, counter disinformation, and protect democracy. She's also a wily political operative, having been on the George W. Bush and Mitt Romney presidential campaigns, led pioneering civic engagement programs at Google, Pew, Twitter, and Change.org, and in fact went from operative to candidate in 2016, running as the vice presidential candidate on independent Evan McMullen's ticket. Mindy, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben.
Well, it's great to be here. So you recently released a report called American Democracy Roadmap, Playbook for Trusted Elections. It really is excellent research with the stated goal of studying the erosion of trust in our election system. And your aim, as you stated, was to provide a greater understanding of the 30% of people who don't have faith in our election. So tell us what prompted you to undertake this research? What had you seen in your career that sort of pointed you towards this moment?
Yeah, well, thank you. So, essentially, we at a high level in doing this work, we want to tackle the crisis of confidence in U.S. elections. There's no doubt, and it's not a surprise. It's well known that we are a polarized nation, polarized by party, by ideology, education, and otherwise. And that's been true for a long time, but it's really been accelerating over the last 20 years. But we are in new territory when it comes to distrust in institutions, distrust in democracy, distrust in elites, and polarization that, we're operating in kind of two different realities, or at least that's conventional wisdom. What we know, though, is that it's a bit of an oversimplification that, while, big media, for example, likes to put everyone into two different boxes of a red or blue, Republican, Democrat, that there really is a more nuanced spectrum. And it's important to understand that. And even, we talk about the 30% who think the 2020 election was illegitimate. Even that group isn't monolithic. They believe that with different levels of intensity. They believe that for a lot of the same reasons, but also sometimes for different reasons. And, some of them are more movable, perhaps, on those views than others. At least that was our hypothesis and what we believed. And so when we put together this playbook, it was really based on, just a hardened belief that we can't accept the fact that, just as a matter of fact, that 30% of our country is going to distrust elections. There's a lot of downstream effects of that, political violence and the like. We can't really accept that. And so we need to do something about it. And we need to unpack that group and unpack the entire electorate and really start to understand, where are the common beliefs, where do we diverge, and where, and most importantly, are the openings and the tools and the interventions that will help to bring more trust to our elections.
Before we get into the specifics, can you recount some of your methodology and the sample that you took to do this? Because you talked, this was really a in-depth dive, and I think it's important to understand just how in-depth it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, first of all, when we do our analysis, we start with a base of over 200 million voters that, we have access to their full vote history, and deep demographic information, and even, media sources, consumer information. So that is what we're using. And we certainly have done, some measures since 2020, but for this specific playbook, it took from insights from research going back to April of 2022 through August, and a total of over 18,000 interviews, as well as a mix of qualitative studies. So surveys that were 4,000 registered voters nationwide, for example, or 2,000 at a time, 3,000 at a time. We did a number of them to take measures at various points, as well as I mentioned, qualitative. So, 90-minute focus groups. Some of this was national. We also went deep into a couple of states, Arizona and Georgia, just seeing them as two of the states that are kind of ground zero for potential election problems.
So to start off, did you see a great difference in the responses you got from the people in Arizona and Georgia than the sort of nationwide attitudes on the subject?
So we did. There's certainly some widespread, nationalized trends. But one thing we found in Arizona and Georgia is that these topics, so the election trust or a belief that there might be election fraud, the interest is so much higher there than the baseline nationally. This really was we like to think that in the past, say, prior to 2020, except around, really election time, there isn't much interest. There certainly wasn't a lot of widespread interest in election administration and how our elections are run and how the votes are counted and whether or not there's fraud. That is a much more salient conversation nationally. And that's even more so in Arizona and Georgia, where you have Republicans in those states in particular, a strong plurality, placing concerns about election integrity and election trust as one of their top three issues that they think is of greatest concern in the country today.
And that's very much a new trend. I mean, in the presidential campaigns you and I worked together on, that was not really a feature of the electorate that we had to deal with. So I think the answer to this is obvious, but what caused that change in attitude amongst voters?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And you're right, like this is new. Sometimes people who like to tamp down alarm about the moment we're in will say, oh, well, they'll point to the data that shows for the last 20 years, at least, you have a third of the losing party in a presidential election that harbors doubts or distrust about the outcome because they're not happy about the outcome. And that's true. But what we're seeing now is a much larger segment of the public, in particular on the Republican side, that is, yes, attributable to the outcome, but what it's also attributed to is the fact that their leader, the former president of the United States, waged a very deliberate campaign to harbor distrust and doubt in the legitimacy and the outcome of the 2020 election. And that was unprecedented. And then obviously there's an infrastructure kind of around him and underneath him who's then perpetuated that lie, that falsehood. And so that is what's new. And I should also just note that we see because of that, or somewhat because of that, and also just because of increased polarization and just such distrust and negative partisanship that exists on really both sides, we start to see some of that distrust, seeping into the left as well. And so we're just in new territory in terms of the fever pitch of the distrust and concern about whether we will have, free and fair elections that voters can trust.
That's so true, really about both sides. And I was struck by one of the findings in your report, which is the partisan infrastructure best positioned to mobilize voters have little incentive to fix it. How come?
Yeah, well, because what parties are really about, is at its simplest form, is winning elections. So they're about getting more power, and in order to get more power, they have to win elections. And that is their mission, kind of number one. And so when it comes to winning elections, the way to do that formula very much depends today on driving kind of fear, raising alarm about threats from the other side. You need to prove less so that you have the formula that's going to move the country forward, and more so that the other side is going to destroy the country. And so we have kind of two forces that are a bit in tension or conflict at play when it comes to building trust in elections. You have, potentially, and I mean, I think there's more awareness now on the parties where some of this has been mediated, but you could have a Democratic Party that is really incentivized to raise the alarm, perhaps in hyperbolic ways, about voter suppression or about threats to election or election subversion, which may be real things, but they're really incentivized to drive the maximum fear about that and drive and assign maximum blame to the other side in order to win votes. And so by doing that, they perhaps are actually breeding further distrust in the process. I think there's a real challenge here in how do you sufficiently raise the alarm about threats to elections, which I strongly believe exist and need to be raised, but how do you do that in a way that isn't further contributing to the distrust, and in a way that is, sober-minded, clear-eyed, truthful, and parties aren't really the ones that you can fully trust to do that. It doesn't mean there aren't any party actors that do it. It just means that the party apparatus is, at the end of the day, going to be focused on winning elections, and they're going to use whatever medium, message, and otherwise to win elections, not necessarily to sustain the grand, experiment and set of institutions that are critical for a healthy democracy.
Yes, it has not been helpful that the get out the vote models of the Republican Party is talking about fraud that's not always been proven, and the Democratic get out the vote model is based on yelling about suppression that is sometimes a little bit overblown.
That's exactly right. It doesn't mean, what parties are going to do is take something where there might be some truth, and we can sit here today and say there's more truth on one side or the other, which I actually do believe, but they're focused on how do we, blow up a narrative and aren't really thinking too much about the backlash effects.
Yeah, and the numbers you found in this survey are stark. 76% have some doubts about whether they'll be able to trust the legitimacy of the 2024 election. 46% voice at least some dissatisfaction with our democracy and the way it works for them. And 40% of Republicans say illegitimate elections and voter fraud are among the top threats. But what does the country need to do to reduce this polarization and really rebuild the trust that you're talking about?
Yeah. So, first of all, I would just say that when it comes to, the institution of our elections, for the most part, they are very well run. They are trustworthy. You have good actors who are in the positions of administering them and running them. And you have poll workers who are just regular folks who show up and want to do a public duty. And, that truth has really been undermined with the campaign that was waged post 2020 to cast doubt on the 2020 elections. Conspiracies are rampant, and election officials and poll workers and such are under attack. And so that is that's sort of the immediate crisis. And we provide in this playbook, we seek to provide some of the tools to help counteract that, which is election officials kind of up and down are suddenly in a position where, as opposed to just having to do their core job, which is run a good election, as well as do some basic communication, they actually need to be prepared to be counter disinformation, communicators and experts. They need to mitigate misinformation. They need to be aware of what's coming. They need to be armed with effective language and messaging and tools to counter it. And so that is, part of what we seek to do here. And what that means is, more kind of neutral language that isn't going to further provoke either side. It also means debunking. We've done a fair amount of rigorous testing of the types of communication that go out by election officials to see what works best, and found, particularly in these states like Arizona and Georgia, where this concern about election integrity is so salient, that debunking is really critical. Getting the facts out really does matter. Of course, it matters who those facts are coming out from. If it's someone who's seen as a political actor, it's not going to be trusted, certainly not going to be trusted by their opposite party. But if it is someone who has some more nonpartisan or institutional cred, then it is going to be more trusted. And you have to get the facts out. More transparency about how our elections are run, for people to understand and see in real time what's happening. There already is a good amount of transparency, but we need more of that. Obviously, getting people that are with the right intentions, that are good faith actors, continuing to get them into positions of that are key for election administration, obviously also in state legislatures, because that comes into play in terms of certifying election results and making decisions about how our elections are run, and making sure we have enough people to work, our elections. Our elections are, for the most part, trustworthy, but as you know well, there's always some, kinds of, issues relative to the number of places, the number of polling places, the number of jurisdictions. There's always just a small, number of problems, but there can be problems. And so one thing that, we've found is you don't want to be too grandiose, and you sound really out of touch if you kind of say our elections are impenetrable, they're locked tight. It's not really true, right? We spent a lot of time after the 2016 election talking about foreign interference and the cybersecurity issues. So I think you have to sort of be willing to call out where there might be some minor issues here and there that are fixed and fixable, and talk about how they're fixed. And you can do that without coddling or catering to this broader idea that the whole system is rotten at its core, and that we can't trust the results of a presidential election.
Yeah, if you were designing the American electoral system all over again at this point, you would not have over 10,000 separate jurisdictions running our elections. And it's really a system that functions because of volunteers who do the job maybe 2 days every other year. So that's not a perfect system. There will always be improvements and changes that need to be made, just like there are new cars with new features every year. Doesn't mean your old car doesn't work. And people need to keep that in mind. One of the other things that you very effectively did in your survey, I thought, was segment the electorate into defenders, shifters, and inhibitors. And when you talk about the right voices and the right message, needs to be a little bit different for each of the groups you indicate in your report. Tell us a little bit about the differences between defenders, shifters, and inhibitors, and then what tactics and opportunities for talking to each.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. So, we segmented the entire electorate into these three broad categories: democracy defenders, democracy shifters, and democracy inhibitors. We use a green, yellow, red coding system because some people are more visual as they think about these groups.
Some are colorblind too.
Right. So, we have a name, we have colors, but the real purpose here, the impetus for this was, for, I think, a lot of the infrastructure that has gone to trying to communicate about our elections, there's sort of this tendency, I think, to preach to the choir inadvertently. It's just, if you're of a group, then you think about communicating as to others who are of that same group. And that's really not what's needed here. What's needed is to communicate to those who do have some doubts about our elections, or are confused or conflicted about what to believe and whom to trust. And so that was our impetus. And what we found is there's this defenders group, and those are democracy defenders, about 20% of the electorate. And those are your, highly politically informed, highly politically engaged, well-educated, democracy believers. And they're not all from one side or the other, over index, one side, but they're not the people that you need to really focus on convincing. They're the kind of people who are going to be most likely to show up as a poll worker, and the types of people you should engage to play roles in the system. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have the democracy inhibitors, and that's the red group. And as the name suggests, these are people who are pretty openly hostile. I mean, they have deep-seated dissatisfaction. They have anger, just extreme anger towards the other side, or even sometimes their own side. They're contributing to division, and they have a high likelihood of believing conspiracy theories. In many cases, they're far down the conspiratorial rabbit hole. These are the most difficult to move, but they are kind of important to still communicate to and try to neutralize, because they're the most likely to provoke political violence or participate in harmful activity. Then there's this really large group in the middle of democracy shifters. They do span right to left. In the report, we wanted to, focus on not just to kind of look at it through a partisan lens, but we do actually have these groups broken out by right to left in other work that we've done. And these shifters are, they have some doubts about our institutions and our elections. They aren't totally closed off, though, to changing their mind. They don't just necessarily, dislike or harbor negative feelings to people who have different views, to experts. They feel guarded. They feel like there's, they don't really know if there's media they can trust. And so we really focus on, in giving strategic guidance here, effective messaging that can focus on countering the misinformation to which they are susceptible. They are susceptible to it, and also to build trust, so that way they can start to rebuild their trust in institutions, and the other side. I mean, I would also say, and this is more of a longer term play, as you try to really listen and hear, what are some of the real concerns that people have, not the people who are just they're trying to stir trouble, but, the majority of the country, who's just kind of the exhausted majority. That's these shifters. You really want to understand kind of how they think, because their views are nuanced, but they're certainly not closed off. They want to trust institutions. They believe in America strongly. They haven't lost faith in democracy totally. And so they're really an important group to communicate to.
And one of the points that you make is that there are different ways to reach different audiences. So let's talk about the shifters in the middle. What is the best way to actually reach them? I assume that goes to media outlets as well as types of media that you use to talk to. Yeah,
that's right. So, this is a group that does watch the news, but they're not the types that are going to be on every social media platform. I mean, to generalize, they live busy lives. You can reach them through kind of the most popular social media platforms. Facebook, Instagram, really are high up on their list. As part of this work, just by the way, we did a lot of study on what are the media sources that these groups most trust. We also broke it down by age. And so to generalize, these are not the ones that are necessarily going to be on, TikTok and watching multiple cable news stations, every single night. But they are on popular social media platforms, or they're highly represented on them, Instagram, Facebook, et cetera. The typical streaming platforms, YouTube, Netflix, et cetera. The other, and you can reach them through, they're watching sports, they're consuming pop culture. But the other really key thing here is, and this is harder to scale, but really important, is that in terms of whom they trust, it really is, they distrust kind of national figures, political figures, people that they don't feel connected to, but they still do have a significant amount of trust in local experts and local authorities. And this is where, of course, you can see people like firefighters and teachers who are always kind of trusted figures, and fortunately are still pretty broadly trusted in communities. But for those that are real experts on elections, election officials still rank pretty highly among them. They're going to trust their personal networks, their neighbors, those who are at their churches and in their community groups, their faith communities most. But election officials still rank pretty high, as well as, just if you are trying to do media or get other spokespeople, firefighters, teachers, like those who are really pillars of the community, and helping keep the community healthy and safe.
And let's talk about that a little bit. So as you're looking at this problem of disaffected voters or non-believing voters, is this a national campaign or a local campaign? In other words, since the 2020 election, the number of people who deny the results has not changed, despite an onslaught from lots of groups doing work, lots of media enterprises calling out the big lie. It's not work. How do you design the program to actually go in and be more effective?
Yeah. So it needs to be a campaign. So there is a role for a nationally organized effort, just because there are certainly trends and key insights and messaging that transcends locality. But in terms of being able to feature, localized messaging so that it is specific to, let's just use Maricopa County, for example. It's important that it's specific to Maricopa County and about Maricopa County elections, even if it's messaging that we know is effective across, for countering the concerns about fraud nationally. So you might have specific messaging that we've identified helps people be less likely to feel that there was fraud in the election, and that can be utilized everywhere, but it really has to be localized. When someone in Maricopa County sees it, it needs to be local, it needs to be related to their election, and it needs to feature officials and people that they will trust are their neighbors, their friends, their even more important experts that are based in and rooted in their community. So that's really important. I mean, this is something we learned. We did some work on the COVID vaccines. There's a lot of overlap in terms of what we learned about that, especially coming in later into the process about what didn't work and then needed to be adjusted to work that can be applied here. You just really need to localize. I will also note, though, that there is a divergence in the trust metric when it comes to trusting, the overall results of a presidential election or elections broadly, and one's local election. It's kind of similar to your, you don't like Congress, but you like your congressman dynamic, where people are more likely to say, oh, elections are broken, I don't trust them, I think there's problems over there. But oh no, I trust my elections. I trust the results from my county or my jurisdiction or my city. And so there isn't as much of a trust problem, but there still is one. And actually, I think you can use that trust that people have in their local elections to start to bring awareness to the fact of how well elections are run, so that they start to have more trust writ large. But getting back to the core of the question, designing a campaign, there is a role for national insights, messaging, what we know about messengers and media channels that can be broadly applied, but then the actual execution and what people see needs to be relatable. It needs to be localized. It needs to feel kind of by and for their communities.
Yeah, I want to go back to what you were talking about, messengers. Very much local as opposed to national for the most part. Trusted sources mean people you know in your community rather than elected officials. But it also seems that different messages are more effective with different age groups as well.
Yes, that's definitely true.
And so as you're designing this campaign, I take it your advice is one size does not fit all, that you're providing a lot of data for how to talk to different age groups. Assume that there's a different strata on income and sort of general circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really important. I mean, I think as we know, things have been changing so fast that, the generational divide where it might just be before that, yes, of course, an 80-year-old's experience is different than maybe a 30-year-old. You now have generational kind of experiences, and media consumption can be quite different even for, those that are 15 years apart. So in our report, we like to break this out by, Gen Z, those who are 18 to 25, millennials, about 26 to 41, Gen X, 42 to 57, baby boomers, and then, above. And we do see a lot of distinctions, even kind of in adjacent generations in terms of their media consumption. I mean, this is kind of an obvious one in that like a Gen Z and younger millennials, they spend a lot of time and turn to TikTok is high up there where that doesn't even resonate for Gen X or baby boomers. You see a lot more of the younger generation being comfortable hearing about these things on social media and even discussing them. Whereas, those that are in more older generations, that's not the case. They are on Facebook, they are on, Instagram. In terms of the messaging, there certainly are, distinctions as well. And so what you're really underscoring is that not only is it not a national campaign that needs to be localized, but you really need to have, essentially different campaigns, sub-campaigns within a broader campaign that are customized and surgically targeted to different generations, as well as, you mentioned kind of income. So yes, income, education, age, and the other dividing line, really is that we see is just the amount of media that people consume and which sources has such an impact on, obviously on a culture, but also how people can be moved.
I also take from your research, this may be overgeneralizing, that broad-based regular television ads are sort of missing the target, that this is much more individualized than that you sort of have to go where people are living.
Yeah. So, broad-based television ads are really useful just because you can get a message out to a lot of people quickly and they can amplify narratives. But with this kind of thing, they also can kind of have a backlash effect. I mean, people, this is very local to people. It's personal. They really distrust the media, like media broadly. So big media, and that means ads on big media aren't going to be as trustworthy as you say, the personalized networks, the local officials, even social media, because that's people's social networks. They're more likely to trust that, and it's part of what makes it a bit challenging, right? You have to penetrate. It's a lot easier. It's obviously more complicated than this. I've been in lots of campaigns where you run television ads, but to simplify it, it's not as simple as just kind of placing a buy and it's plug and play and you go. It's much more complicated when you're trying to penetrate a web of people's personal networks, connections, community organizations, their WhatsApp groups and their text chats and, the things that they most pay attention to in today's noisy media environment.
Yeah, really, really important point. Let's talk a little bit more about what you did in Arizona and Georgia and come back to something you said before about debunking misinformation as opposed to pre-bunking, which would be talking about it and telling a story beforehand. And you found that debunking was more effective. And so tell us why.
Yeah, so thank you for asking about that. So this was a really interesting finding that we couldn't have really expected until we did the research about the ways that you try to counter or mitigate misinformation. And I would say election misinformation in particular. There was a lot of kind of predated, political science and other social science that predated, this work, where kind of the sense that fact checking or debunking doesn't work. Fact checking became kind of popular to do, in the last couple of decades, where you had like factcheck.org and you had, news organizations trying to create these fact checking sites. And, generally they were seen to be a bit of a failed experiment, I would say, in terms of actually changing the minds of the people who needed the fact check. So I think it was a bit surprising to us when we found we ran some randomized control trial, in-field survey experiments where we tested reaction to real content that, in Arizona's case, the Maricopa County Election Department, so the Maricopa County Recorder, was putting out both to pre-bunk and to debunk the idea that vote by mail was not secure, and the way that vote by mail works and is tracked and processed in Maricopa County. And in Georgia, we did it on the statewide level. So the Secretary of State's office and content that they were putting out. And what we found is, so at Arizona, we tested sort of a pre-bunking set of content and debunking. So pre-bunking is just trying to communicate straight up. That there's a disbelief, say, in vote by mail. And so it's trying to say this is something that's secure and verifiable, and you kind of explain how it works. That's pre-bunking. Debunking is actually presenting the myth. So being very clear about, here's the myth. In Maricopa, it's that Maricopa County's ballot duplication process allowed illegitimate ballots to be counted, and say that's false, and then present the facts. So it's more of a traditional fact check. And we found that when respondents were presented with this debunking versus pre-bunking approach, they were much more likely to be persuaded and thus to have more faith and confidence in the system and the fact that, their vote was counted accurately and that the outcome was legitimate with the debunking approach. In Georgia, we took what we learned in Arizona and we tested sort of two different ways of debunking, what we would call a low dose and a high dose. Low dose was just a shorter, kind of message. Often in politics, they say if you're explaining, you're losing. And we certainly know that some media platforms, now it's just become really popularized or part of the culture to just be very short and brief in your explanation. So we tested a low dose debunking and what we call a high dose. High dose was still just, a couple paragraphs. We're not talking about someone needing to read a white paper or watch a longer form video. And we found here that you actually see that the high dose, the high dose strategy was most effective overall. So both debunking strategies were effective, but high dose was even more effective. And the reason we think this debunking strategy was effective for election misinformation in particular, and in these states in particular, first of all, it was the framing. I mean, they were from official departments that are still pretty trusted as, nonpartisan institutions, number one, with most of the electorate, but two, that this is an issue that is so salient and there's been so much coverage of that among those democracy shifters, they really are just confused and seeking to understand, for some of them, the truth. And so I think that's really our hypothesis here. We're really excited to do a lot more of testing that builds on this, both, kind of in this next month, but also in the aftermath of 2022 to help election officials and those that support them be even more effective and prepared headed into 2024.
Let's talk about election officials for whom both you and I have a great deal of respect and admiration for the jobs that they're doing. But what's the program that you would give election officials to carry out in this last month before the election to give their voters more confidence in the system? Essentially, the program that we would give them, because there's election officials and then there's those that are kind of doing to work to try to
amplify and bolster election officials outside of them. But for election officials themselves, it would really be empowering, training them in communications and effective media practices, because in many cases they are going to be in the spotlight, or they potentially could be in the spotlight, I should say. We hope they won't be, but if there are any kind of issues and it's a very close election, they will be in the spotlight, and there's certainly a higher likelihood they'll be in the spotlight in these times than in past times. And so training them, providing talking points, both, that are in line with these recommendations in this playbook, as well as updated and refreshed points as we get closer to election, and certainly in the event of what I'd call a crisis, where post-election you have a prolonged recount, or set of lawsuits or other things that are creating a crisis like we saw in 2020. Definitely elevating, and there's some risk in this just because election officials are being targeted with death threats and other things, but elevating those who are willing, their voices, their faces, their images, not just kind of the top election official, but others within the department, others in more local jurisdictions, featuring them kind of in the voter education and outreach that goes out, so that it is personalized. People can attach, that there's just kind of a local community member, someone they can relate to, who is sharing, the information that voters need to hear about how our elections are run, and why voters can trust them. It would also include just being very, and I would say that Maricopa County, Stephen Richer and his team in Maricopa County do a great job about this, is more communication is better. So communicating through social media and, many of the different channels, as many as, they're capable of doing, between Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and local media, and any other networks that they're able to, the steps in the process. So when ballots go out, when they drop in various places, when they're coming in, that they're being counted, as much transparency about that process, that is, they're reasonably able to do, and is doesn't cause greater risk, the better, so that voters are able to see that and understand, and it's not so black boxy. They really demystify it for voters. Some of this myth fact stuff. So providing, sets of guidance on this myth fact guidance about, vote by mail and how ballots are counted, or if they have drop boxes, how that works, when vote ballots are going to be counted, the various audits that are already built into the system, the counting, all of the pieces and steps of the election process.
So as we close out, let's just pull back a bit. This is an excellent study, but the question still comes down to, how do you best put this into practice? So who is the driving force? What does the organization or the components of the organization look like? What are the action steps that need to be taken?
Yeah, this is a really, really great question. I would say that, we certainly sort of do our best as an organization, and working with other partners in the field, including ones you're involved with, Ben, to get this in the hands of as many election officials as we can, to field calls and provide support to them as needed, to train the trainers, so that this this is distributed, this guidance is distributed prior to the election. And I think have done a reasonably good job. But the fact of the matter is, as you said, there's 10,000 plus jurisdictions, and there's just more infrastructure that needs to be in place, I would say, before 2024. There's guidance, which we know that some of these election officials are heeding and they're utilizing, but you really need more infrastructure on the ground, both within those departments, or being able to work hand in glove with those departments on the ground, so that they're able to execute and implement in real time. And that is something that I certainly hope is built out as we head to 2024. As we coming from presidential campaigns or those kinds of large scale organizations, I've long, if I could wave a magic wand, would say you would have, almost a presidential election size, infrastructure to just focus on the project of ensuring that voters have faith and confidence and can trust our election outcomes. And that would involve, state-based organizations, county-based organizations, a whole, communications apparatus and research and messaging and paid media and earned media and organizing and the like. And so there is some of that happening, of course, but it's not as organized. And so that is certainly what we're kind of focused on doing along with others as we head towards 2024 is how do you create, first of all, start to focus on even the parts of the electorate that we've identified here, the shifters and the movable inhibitors, so that you're setting your targets on the right people. You're trying to instill trust with those who don't trust as opposed to preaching to the choir, and that we are creating more coordination and providing more assets and resources to those that are already in positions to be trusted messengers on the ground, and they already have constituencies and publics that listen to them, that trust them, and that they can reach.
Mindy Flynn, the CEO of Citizen Data and the author of a recent report, American Democracy Roadmap, Playbook for Trusted Elections. Thanks so much for being with us. This is Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables, and I'm Ben Ginsberg. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society and improve the human condition. For more information about our work, or to listen to more of our podcast or watch our videos, please visit hoover.org.